We believe in the power of the law to advance democracy, equity, and justice. It takes a collective effort to transform lives and protect the well-being of our communities. Let's renew our commitment to our shared ideals. Let's stand at the forefront of the issues of the day. Hello, I am Mary Smith, President of the American Bar Association, and we are thrilled to be kicking off the ABA Presidential Speaker Series. Under the theme, Lifting Our Voices, Charting the Future, these fireside chats will spotlight trailblazers shaping our collective future, inspiring thought, and fostering understanding of pressing global issues. Today, we host a conversation with Ivo Daalder, Chief Executive Officer of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and host of World Review with Ivo Daalder. He served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO under President Barack Obama. He also served as Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council staff. Today's conversation will be moderated by Ambassador Ertharin, President and CEO of Food Systems for the Future. She also serves as a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and was executive director for the United Nations World Food Program. Previously, she was U.S. ambassador to the UN Agencies for Food and Agriculture in Rome. Welcome, Ambassadors Daalder and Cousin.
Ambassador Daalder, Ivo. Let's start by talking a bit about you. You were born in the Netherlands and moved to the U.S. How old were you when you moved to the U.S.? And how do you think growing up in post-World War II Europe, how did it influence your perceptions of international relations and security, or did it?
Ertharin, great to see you, Ambassador Cousin. Wonderful to be here. Yeah, I am an immigrant in the true sense of the word. Not first generation. I came here as a 24-year-old to go to graduate school, and met my wife. As I jokingly say, you know her well, so it is a joke. I married her for a green card, and 36 years later, we're still happily married as part of that. But yeah, I spent half my life in Europe and half my life in the United States when you sort of add it all up in one form or another. And that means I sort of embody transatlantic relations and thinking. And the most important part of that is indeed the experience, not just of the Cold War, actually, but of World War II and what happened afterwards. My parents were they're no longer with us. They went through World War II, in my father's case, through occupation for 5 years by the Germans of the Netherlands, and in my mother's case, a survivor of the Holocaust, who had everything you can expect to come with that as part of that experience. Although she was able to get to Switzerland in late 1942 with her sister and mother, and have the war out there. So the war in my household at the dinner table. And what happened afterwards was really central to my own intellectual development. Yes, the Cold War was, of course, something that was raging when I was born in 1960 and throughout my youth and into my early forays in university life. And until I actually graduated, I wrote my dissertation on NATO nuclear weapons, and it turned into overnight into a history book from a policy analysis. Unfortunately, we may be coming back to those kinds of issues today. But it sort of the war and its centrality, the idea that countries could engage in incredible brutality and whipped up in a way by leaders. Was something I thought a lot about and worried a lot about, and devoted most of my life to figuring out how do you prevent this from happening. And so it was pretty central. Now, the other part that's important is, as someone who grew up in post-war Europe, I grew up at a time that the United States was still seen as truly a beacon on in the distance as the city on the hill, the shining city on the hill. And so the idea of going to the United States, of living in the United States, of being part of that incredible experiment, which and unique experiment, was very, very attractive. So from very early on, I wanted to move to the United States. I didn't think about whether I'd become a citizen or not, and all those things that comes later. But it was very much something that I looked up to, and I compared that to sort of people grown up in the last 20, 30 years in Europe today, looking at the United States, and frankly, unfortunately, the perspective is not the same as when I was there.
It is unfortunate because as someone who has spent a great deal of my career in Europe, the relationship and the admiration that many Europeans have for Americans and for our form of government and our peaceful handover of power through free and fair elections is as you note, is being challenged by things that are happening today. But it has not yet impacted the very long-standing diplomatic relationships that we have with allies across Europe. But before we get into those relationships, I want to spend a little more time talking about you personally. Can you give us a key moment early in your career that shaped your perspective around global affairs and diplomacy? You've talked about how your growing up affected. Was there anything in your early career that shaped your perspective on global affairs and diplomacy?
I mentioned the fact of World War II and its immediate aftermath was in many ways a defining issue for my generation. But if there's one event I have to pick out that was early on, it was probably the anti-nuclear protests that were engulfing much of Europe, including the time I was living in England, but also the Netherlands and, of course, Germany, and the United States, for that matter, the nuclear freeze movement. We're talking about the late 1970s and really the early 1980s. I was at university during those years. This was really a sort of a remarkable public uproar at a time when people were still very worried about where the Soviet Union was going and the threat that it represented. In 1979, it invaded Afghanistan, and the first time that it was really sort of moving beyond its own immediate sphere of influence, if you can use that phrase. And it was a defining moment for the Carter administration. But then you had this reaction to what in many ways was over time a quite routine event. The idea to deploy certain nuclear weapons in Europe. We had at the time 7,000 American nuclear weapons in Europe, and adding some more. In this case, longer range missiles. But the furor it exacted, and sort of the deep division it created between certainly European publics and their governments and the American government really led me to say, how does this happen? This, after all, was a U.S. response to a German and indeed European demand to deploy these nuclear weapons in view of the threat, and yet the situation just went out of hand, and it influenced me in two ways. One, it is an issue that I therefore started to look at NATO and nuclear weapons. I did a master's thesis on it. I did my dissertation on it, and I focused even until recently. These are issues that keep me busy from a policymaking perspective and of an interest. But the second piece, which is probably the more defining, was I really became fascinated by alliance relationships. How do alliances who are geographically distant, where countries have different interests, how do they manage their differences, and how do they act in a way that makes the sum larger than the whole larger than the sum of the parts? And if there's any continuity in anything I've ever done, it was sort of thinking about how do alliances operate in different circumstances. And I think it comes from that amazing turmoil that really upset the NATO alliance and U.S.-European relations and defined it in a very, very central way for a period of time when I, as I said, was in university, which is usually a time for deeper thought because you have time and efforts, and plenty of partying too. But even at the partying, you were discussing, certainly I was, these kinds of issues. So I'd go back to that one.
You're probably a very interesting college date. That's
don't know about that, but some of them thought was pretty boring. But
you've spoken about how in your early career, your perspectives regarding NATO and alliances and NATO's role in European security was affected by your early studies. But in 2014, you recently left as the U.S. representative to NATO. That was in a time when Russia's annexation of Crimea. How did that situation challenge or reinforce your understanding of NATO's role in ensuring European security?
So, I mean, it was a remarkable set of events that of course, now looking back at it, was just the first move in a larger move. But at the time, there was still a very big debate in Europe, in the United States, on whether the United States and NATO could have done something different to convince Russia that using military force against the neighbor is not the right thing. And there was a debate about whether NATO, in fact, had provoked Russia from acting, that its enlargement, its expansion to countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and then into the former Soviet Union, with a promise in 2008 to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, that had provoked Vladimir Putin. For me, this was the definitive proof that you actually were dealing with a Russian leader that we have known from history, expansionist, believing fundamentally that the security of Moscow, of the heart of Russia, depended on making sure that your neighbors were subjugated. Something Russian history, throughout Russian history, has been a central theme of Russian politics, and that this very short, and it turned out to be very short, interregnum of less than a couple of decades, in which Russia, in a post-Soviet sphere, was trying to figure out a way whether it could be part of the more Western way of doing business, that had failed, and that we were back into a situation in which the only way you could persuade a Russia not to act in certain ways is through strength. It also sort of therefore underscored that security vacuums in Europe, which we hadn't really thought about for about 20 or 30 years because of the end of the Cold War, all of a sudden were becoming important. And that if the good guys didn't fill it, the bad guys would. And so the difference between an Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, also three parts of the former Soviet Union, although we never recognized it as such, that had become members of both the European Union and NATO in 2004 and 2007, they were left unscathed. But a country like Georgia, or a country like Ukraine, that was neither a member of NATO nor a member of the European Union, became an easy target for a much more superior Russia. And so it underscored the centrality of not just the U.S. role in Europe, which we learned in World War II, but the stabilizing influence of having countries be part of a security system that enabled them to look at their own internal development rather than having to fear their external aggression, and making the price of aggression for a country like Russia just too high. That was the lesson. I don't think we learned it really well, given what happened in 2022. And I hope we certainly learn it now, because the only way ultimately to resolve this conflict is to allow Ukraine to do what it wants to do, and the overwhelming majority of Ukrainian people wants to do, which is to be part of the West.
We have a couple questions from our audience. Jose Castro, the ABA Young Lawyers Division Civic Engagement Director, has a specific question that he'd like to ask you. Jose?
Funding for Ukraine is uncertain at this point. How does this administration move forward with its support for Ukraine, given the partisan and ideological split in Congress?
Yeah, Jose. I think the way to think about this is that the idea that there is a huge split on this issue in our nation or even in Congress is actually wrong. There is a very large bipartisan agreement in both houses of Congress, in the Senate and in the House, in favor of continuing to support Ukraine militarily and even economically. By the way, there's also a very large and substantial majority of the American public that believes that. Indeed, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs this week released a new set of data from a poll that we conducted last month, in which 63% of Americans still believe that it is important to continue to provide international assistance and military assistance to Ukraine, and far from seeing a drop in support, that has been pretty steady for about a year now. It dropped from the beginning of the war until July and then in November, but for the last year, it's been pretty steady. There are big partisan differences. Democrats are more in favor of it than Republicans, but even among Republicans, a majority still believes, small majority, but believes that supporting Ukraine militarily is important. So the problem we have is, and we've been watching this with great incredulity this week on our television screens, is that there is a divide and a dysfunction in one house and in one party. I mean, the House GOP is unable to come to an agreement on how and for what purpose to govern. And Ukraine aid has become one, but certainly not the only victim of that division. And so I think it's important for all of us to understand that the dysfunction we're seeing is actually not a dysfunction of Washington. It's a dysfunction of one particular party in one particular house that is affecting us all. Now, that dysfunction has repercussions for everyone. But as we saw in the run-up to both the debt negotiations and, of course, the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. But it also showed that there was a willingness at times to move bipartisanly in a way forward, as we did by keeping the government open and having a continued resolution. I therefore have no doubt that when it comes to the need to make real decisions, when, for example, the money that is available to provide for Ukraine truly runs out, which it hasn't yet, that we still have monies available in the U.S. To provide the Ukraine with support, there will be a bipartisan vote that will reaffirm and continue that fine kind of assistance. So I'm less pessimistic about this than most, although I'm pretty pessimistic about the state of the Republican Party in the House, as I think all of us should be, because this is not who we are, and this is not what the example we want to set for our children or even for our friends and enemies abroad.
Let's pick up on that last point that you just made about the example that we want to set for our friends or our enemies. And so how do you see these political debates within the U.S. regarding funding for Ukraine impacting our relationship with particularly our NATO allies?
So I think there's two important things happen. One is that the Ukraine crisis has sort of reaffirmed in a way that I think people had forgotten the absolute centrality of American leadership. And it was the leadership of the current administration, current president, that was extraordinarily important to rally the Western world and much of the rest of the world. Remember, 140 plus countries have consistently voted in the UN to condemn Russia's actions against Ukraine as a violation of international law as clearly it is. But the fact that there is this panic now in Europe and in other places about, oh my God, they failed to appropriate $6 billion. The world's falling apart for Ukraine. Just demonstrates the absolute centrality of the United States still to how the world is governed and how the world is run. And we've gone through cycles of believing that the United States was in decline. You may recall at the end of the Cold War, Paul Kennedy, the historian, wrote a famous book on the rise and fall of great powers, predicting that the United States would disappear as a major power in the world. We've seen, at the time it was the Cold War is over and Japan and Germany won. More recently, it's been about China taking over from the United States. None of these countries are able to do what the United States has uniquely been able to do over the last 80 years, which is to lead the system with all flaws of that leadership, of which there are many, from Vietnam to Iraq, to the way we have dealt with Afghanistan and so many others. But nevertheless, a willingness and an ability to lead that no one else has. And that's where the problem lies, because it isn't China or Russia or even some of the big global issues that are undermining America's capacity to lead. It's America that is undermining America's capacity to lead. And these domestic dysfunctions that we're seeing and we've seen them in a whole variety of ways, including presidents unwilling to accept that they lose elections and an insurrection on Capitol Hill, and everything else we've seen, including deposing a speaker by people in their own party. The first time in U.S. history that has happened. It's that is undermining America's standing. And with America's standing being undermined, its capacity to lead. And the result of a lack of leadership isn't that there's some alternative leader. No, it's chaos. It's disorder. It's the inability to deal with the very, very real problems we have. And even some of America's enemies understand that the world is a better place when America is predictable and when it acts in a way that is predictable than if it's unpredictable and chaotic. And that is, frankly, the image we have left for, unfortunately, all too many years now.
You touched on a bit of the relationship and the tensions between the U.S. and China. How do we as nations and governments with intertwined economies between the U.S. and Chinese, how can we navigate the increasing political tensions while increasing our economic ties for the prosperity of both countries?
This is a really tough issue, and perhaps look at it in a variety of different levels, right? So at its core, what we are witnessing is the remarkable, really, truly, historically unique emergence of China, much of it because of the sacrifice of the Chinese people, an incredible desire by the people to invest in their own future. And we've seen this incredible rise in prosperity, 400 to 500 million people joining the middle class in the last generation, plus an incredible reduction in poverty. And increase in well-being of the Chinese, which we can only celebrate as an example of both the ingenuity of the Chinese people and the importance of having an open international economic system to benefit from it. So that's one thing. But as powers grow, their interests expand. A country like Benin will have different interests than a country like Kenya, and Kenya will have different interests than a country like China because of the size that it represents. So the fact that you're going to have conflict or disagreements about how power is distributed and what one does with that power globally is sort of natural given what's happened with the rise of China. But then secondly, Part of the rise of China has been because, as I mentioned, this open economic system, as you rightly said, this intertwining of our economies. This is not the Cold War, when Russia or the Soviet Union and the United States were economically equidistant, with very little exception, some exception in the energy field and grain and agricultural field, but not in any way else. Our economy is completely intertwined with the United States. Everything in our living rooms, including the computers that we are talking to, are assembled and fabricated in China, and everything in between. And that's not going to change. There's no way we're going to, quote, decouple the U.S. economy from the Chinese economy. It's just not possible. We wouldn't be able to do what we do, to live in the way we live, by completely sort of saying we won't trade with China anymore. And indeed, if you look at trade relations, they are deepened over the year. At the same time, we still have conflict. We still have competition. We have different interests, and they may collide. And so there is an interest in, and I think this is in some ways bipartisan, in finding ways to limit the vulnerability of the United States to China, particularly in the national security field. And so we've engaged in all kinds of export controls and limitations to try to compete more effectively with China on a whole series of issues, from semiconductors to quantum computing to robotics to artificial intelligence and the like, in order, and of course in the military realm, in order to compete more effectively. The key, as we learned during the Cold War, is how can we compete without descending into some spiral of confrontation that leads us into a direct military confrontation that I believe strongly neither side wants. We don't want to go to war against China, and China doesn't want to go to war against us. And so finding ways through communicating and talking to each other about issues of common interest and common concern while competing at the same time is the trick.
We've talked about Russia, we've spoken about China, and the need of what continues to underscore or chapeau over your comments are these alliances that you talked about early on that direct your thinking about global order and global and how we maintain the relationships that allow us to live together on this small planet. Many have been in discussion these days about the challenges to democracy and the rise of different nations challenging the U.S. post-World War II hegemony, and the fact that this is creating potentially more conflict and less opportunity for the type of relationship building for the betterment of the societies that you've just described. How can we as a global community that has relied upon a rules-based order recognize and accept, or should we recognize and accept the different forms of government beyond democracy, and how do we maneuver between the changes that are happening at national and state level in so many countries around the globe and maintain, not just with China or with Russia, but the entire global community, the type of pluralistic and multicultural values that are necessary for us to have a future, a more peaceful and prosperous future?
You know, that is such an important question, Ertharin, and a difficult one, and an important, one that I think we don't spend enough time thinking about. Clearly, we don't live, and we're not going to be living in a world where everybody is the same. Whether that is how they are governed, how they look, how they deal with issues of economic prosperity, diversity and differences are inherent in the reality that on a planet of 8 billion people, people have different experiences, different histories, different backgrounds, different cultures. So the question has been, how do you maintain some sense of order, some sense of an ability to figure out how the world operates, and doing it at the same time in a way that recognizes the diversity and celebrates it, and understands that justice some form of justice needs to exist for order to be real. I mean, you can have order through suppression and dictatorship, but that's not the kind of order we want. And balancing sort of the need for rules and enforcing those rules and understanding those rules with the need for justice and making sure that where injustice exists, there's an opportunity to rectify the situation is kind of the issue that we confront. I think it has to start with the recognition that diversity is the reality, not something that can either be wished away or is unnatural. It is totally natural, and it needs to be not only recognized but celebrated for what it is. That's number one. I think two, the rules that we have of this rules-based order, some of them I think go across every path of diversity, every national, ethnic, geographic line. The idea that borders should not be changed by force, for example, and there are others. We need to reaffirm those rules, and we need to make sure that if they are violated, that those who are violated are brought to justice or are brought to accept that those rules are real. And then third, we have to understand that the world isn't the same as it was in 1945. There are many other countries. There are many other interests. There are many other issues that are now equally important. No one in 1945 thought about climate change. Now we have to. It is existential. It is destroying the planet we live on, or making our life on this planet unbearable if it is not addressed. And that requires the reality that some of the structures and some of the organizations and some of the ways we do our business need to adjust to that reality. There are voices out there that need to be heard and given a platform to be heard, and frankly aren't being heard because old powers dominate the current institutions, whether that's the permanent five in the UN Security Council, or how the IMF votes or World Bank votes are distributed, or a whole series of other ways in which the international order, the international system reflects ideas, power relationships that were prevalent in the 1940s and 50s, as opposed to those that are defining the next 3/4 of this century. And so finding room for those voices and, in fact, having them be part of formulating new rules and addressing the issues that they confront directly is the challenge. It's a challenge of our time. Frankly, it is not an issue that gets as much attention as it deserves.
As you look forward to the next decade, what pivotal moments or decisions do you believe will shape the trajectory of global affairs and global relations, international relations?
So I think a number of those are important. One is we really need to get to the bottom of what happens in the dysfunction of our own political system. I do think that what happens in the United States in the next 10 years is probably the most defining element for the future of our globe because of the central role the United States plays. And whether we go from an age of order to an age of disorder, I think depends in a great deal, not solely, but a great deal on what happens internally in the United States. So that's one thing to watch. Second is China is facing a set of issues, economic, demographic, environmental, social, that are posing a set of challenges to the leadership, and particularly to President Xi Jinping, that he will have to manage. And their success in managing that over the next 10 years, or in contrast, their failure, will have a significant impact on what happens in the world. And then third, I think the question is whether the countries that are now grouped, and I think that's it's not the right way, but for want of a better phrase, that's known as the Global South. The countries that, in fact, are the future of our planet because they are more numerous. They, in terms of in terms of population. They're more numerous in terms of countries, and they have a say and a role to play in addressing our big issues. You can't solve climate change without countries in the global south, from India to South Africa to Brazil, playing a positive role in it. I mean, whatever we do in Europe or the United States or Asia, if the rest of the world doesn't, we're in trouble. And so I think the question is, how do these countries organize themselves and collaborate to have a larger voice and impact on the actual decisions that are made at the global level? And so far, it is their division, their relative weakness that has allowed countries like the United States and China, and to a lesser extent Russia and the European Union, to either ignore them or play them one against the other. And if the countries are able to find a way to exert their voice by acting in a way that others cannot ignore, that will have a major impact, and so will its failure.
And you talked about the global South as being vital to us addressing the challenges that are ahead of us. So let's speak very quickly about some of those challenges that are ahead of us. We know that we are not on track to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals that the entire global community embraced, including the one, as you know, that's close to my heart, and that is ending hunger. We are not on track to meeting the Paris Accord. Do you see the decisions being made within those countries that will support the work that is required for us to overcome the potential failure to meet any of the goals that we've, as a global community, have deemed as critical to the survival of this planet?
Again, a really important question, and Ertharin, you've thought about this probably more than anybody else I know about how to then spend your entire career devoted to figuring out ways in which you can mobilize the international community to deal with these issues, and would love to sort of get your take on it as well. I mean, I think the fundamental problem we face is that these issues, deep and structural and vital as they are long-term, can be solved only by long-term changes in direction, and whether it's in how we grow our food, or how we deal with fossil fuel emissions, or how we change the way people think about each other. They are deeply pressing, but their solution requires long-term change. And nations are not well suited to think long-term, particularly the leaders in nations to think long-term, because the leaders in nations think about how to maintain power the next day, week, month, or year, but certainly not how to change the international response to these issues. So that's the worrying part. But here's the potentially good part. If we take climate change as an issue, I think there's now a realization that this is not a problem of tomorrow. It's a problem of today. And as a result, with the right kind of government policies, and that's a big if you're going to get it, there are now an attempt to incentivize people to engage in change in a way that they wouldn't have thought possible. And the people who are leading that effort are the people who are going to be on this planet longest. They're our children. They're the younger generation. And they are fully aware that if a change doesn't happen, they don't have the luxury to be able to live with that. And that's from societal things, dealing with the issues of diversity and inclusion and equity, to global issues like hunger, managing diseases, global diseases. Malaria is becoming again a big issue, and bigger issue to climate change, and understanding that we need to tackle these things. And so The hope lies in the next generation. It doesn't, as I tell my kids, and they remind me, we screwed it up. And so it's up to them to figure out. It may not be fair, but that's the way. Life isn't fair. It is up to them to help find ways and force leaders to act in the way that they need to act to address those kinds of issues. Maybe not a satisfactory answer, but probably is the only good one I have. But tell me what else can we do?
Ivo, you and I are two, and I say comfortably speaking to you, leaders who are of the same generation, of the same age, and so our lens is quite similar. The reality that we are leaving much to our children and to those in the next generations. But that gets us right to the theme of the ABA's presidential series this year of lifting our voices and charting the future. What message would you like to convey to the next generation of leaders and change makers?
It's the message that the future is now. And so they're, and I'm not doing that just in terms of climate change. If they want to have a better future, acting now is absolutely important. And that means to get involved. And it means to be part of the process. We may not like the process, but it's the only way to change it is on the inside. Mm-hmm. We live in a country, you and I, mm-hmm. in which 3/4 of the people under 30 don't vote. And political power in our country is largely determined by voting. Yes, there are other interests and there are other reasons why things happen in the way they do. But this is a power that everybody has. You get it when you are born, or if you're an immigrant, when you become a citizen. And it is incredibly important that you use that power. But it's not just about voting. It's about organizing. It's about getting people to the polls. It's about registering them. It is, if you want to change, then you need to find ways to bring communities together in order to deal with the future, which is now, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on hunger, whether it's on dealing with immigration, whether it's dealing on injustices, whatever the issue is, thinking that others were going to take care of it, thinking that this is an issue that is important, but I can't be bothered, just means it won't happen. And so, I'm gratified with the next generations that are now starting to come of age, where it seems that there is a social consciousness and an ability and willingness to engage, and lack of fear to confront authority, and in fact challenge authority to do the right thing. That is how we, quote, lift our voices. It's their voices that count. Frankly, our voices may count, and we will be part of it. But if they don't do it, we can't do it for them. And I'll go further. What they will do will have a far greater impact than what we are going to be able to do from now on, just because of where we are in our own generational development. So that's what I would say is the future is now. If you think about, well, I'll do that tomorrow, I'll do it some other time, or, I got to go and I can't be bothered to get to register to vote, you're losing out. And the result is perhaps what we are seeing sometimes today.
Okay, Ivo, before we let you go, we have a couple questions from our audience. The first question is from David Schwartz. David is the chair of the ABA International Law Section. David, over to you.
Ambassador, in 2018, you published The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership. It's now been 5 years and a change in the administration. Is America still abdicating its throne? Has another country been able to take it over? And what, if anything, should we be doing about it?
David, thanks for that question. And the empty throne was a warning about what can go wrong, and almost did. I think, and this may sound like a partisan comment, but I don't think it is. I think that Joe Biden is sitting on that throne. He's taken it back. No other country has come in. But I do think President Biden, as I mentioned earlier in one of my answers, has been able to cajole the world in a way that has been extraordinarily effective with regard to Ukraine. Yes, we can criticize this and that aspect, but the reality is that the countries of Europe and the countries of of Asia have come together in trying to severely limit the economic interaction of Russia with the rest of the world. Not totally, but it is done better than most, and fundamentally change the attitudes towards Russia from one in which Russia was seen as part of the solution to where it's now seen as the absolute problem, particularly in Europe. Together, the United States and Europe and its friends have marshaled $250 billion in resources for economic, humanitarian, and military assistance to Ukraine, without which Ukraine would be in even more dire straits than it is today. And that doesn't happen automatically. It requires true leadership. So I think the U.S. has demonstrated an ability to do this. I think it's the time when we wrote The Empty Throne was also a time when countries were worried about the absence of American leadership and worried about what would happen. And we now understand how important it is, and also understand why a lot of people are worried about our politics right now, because if it goes in the wrong direction, then the ability to reclaim the throne and remain on it is going to be fleeting, if not totally absent forever.
Our next question comes from Rula Alush. Rula is the chair of the ABA Center for Human Rights.
The rule of law and an independent judiciary are key guarantors of democracy, human rights, and good governance. Unfortunately, since 2015, there have been a series of attacks on judicial independence and the rule of law in Poland. Currently, the most concerning issues are the political considerations in the judicial appointment and disciplinary processes. What can NATO do to address the rule of law concerns and the resulting tensions between EU and Poland and other EU members?
Well, the rule of law is sort of at the core of the European project, and as it is indeed in democratic societies writ large. And this is, in fact, the issue. It is the fundamental issue that has divided the European Union institutions from some of its members, notably Hungary and, of course, Poland. The European Union has two mechanisms in which to try to influence these countries. One is it actually has an expulsion capacity. It could expel a member, unlike in NATO, in which there is no expulsion mechanism. The EU has one. Of course, it requires all but the country concerned to agree, and that is difficult. But the second thing, and more effective way to deal with it, is funding. Countries like Poland and Hungary depend on EU resources. There's a transfer mechanism of some countries pay in and other countries receive funds. And the EU has quite successfully, although not completely successfully, but quite successfully used both the threat and the actual cutoff of funding in order to try to influence the behavior of the governments that are no longer abiding by the rule of law. So in the good rule of law institutions, you're using the rules that exist in order to incentivize, in this case, countries as opposed to individuals, but countries to play the right, to do the right thing, and that's how it should, because the alternative is the kind of chaos that no one wants.
Ambassador Ivo Daalder, my friend Ivo, thank you for the generous time that you've given to this conversation today. I believe that you've provided our audience with a great deal of food for thought. But before we go, let me say thank you not only to you, but to the ABA, and indeed turn it back over to our friend, the president of the ABA, Mary Smith. Mary.
What a fabulous conversation to begin the ABA Presidential Speaker Series. Thanks to Ivo Daalder and Ertharin Cousin for such a thought-provoking chat. And if you enjoyed this, there's more to come. Join us on Thursday, October 12th, as we continue the series with legendary civil rights icon and labor leader Dolores Huerta, interviewed by Reverend Miguel Bustos. And consider joining and becoming active in the ABA. Go to ambar.org/membership. Thanks for joining us.